And because Sandy asked the question that he asked last week, this led me down a little bit of a rabbit hole. So I want to try something this week. And we're going to do a little advanced Talmud tonight, okay? Which is, I want to show you that in the commentary tradition, this question of Halach, I'll go over it, I'll resituate ourselves so that we remember exactly where we are. Right? But this question of this word, Halach, here you go, is the subject of considerable dispute. And I think, Sandy, I'm right that you asked, sort of, wait, what does this mean? So how do we understand this? What's the legal consequence? So what I want to do today is show you Rashi, and then show you the position, which is really the dominant position of the school of the Ramban, Nachmanides, the sort of Provençal world. And then to show you Ritzbah, Yom Tov ben Avraham, who's a real Spanish authority. And then Maimonides' position, which is interpreted in a strange way by another Spanish scholar, okay? And so that if we are confused about what this word means and how and what its sort of legal ramifications are, we are in good company, and that the whole commentary tradition attempts to explain this. And so I think it's a reasonable introduction. I mean, a lot of what I've been trying to do is sort of show you the inner workings of the Talmud itself. But so much of what the traditional study of Talmud is about is not only studying the Talmud's opinions within that generation, but then within the generations that follow, how the Talmud is understood by a variety of medieval authorities, whom I'd like to sort of introduce you to. And in many ways, it's really this piece which is the real focus of traditional Talmud study. That so much of Talmud study is not only understanding the words of the Talmud, and right, but trying to read it through this person's lens or read it through this person's lens, and to try to figure out what makes each one tick and why they say what they say. Okay.
So I just have a question before we launch into that. Is Vahelach, is that Aramaic?
Well, it's a good question. It's probably technically Hebrew. Ha lecha. I guess it's sort of a mixed ha.
So okay, ha is Aramaic for.
Is Aramaic for zeh, just like in. Sorry.
It's Aramaic for
zeh, this.
Zeh, yeah.
For instance, in the Haggadah, when we say ha lachma anya da'achalu avatana, right? Ha lachma anya zeh lechem oni. This is poor people's bread.
So this says this yours to you.
This is yours. It's yours. Exactly right. So maybe before we do that, I'll catch us up in the Talmud. Okay. So remember, oops. That's weird. No, it doesn't want me to do that. Very strange. That's that. But I want to share a different thing. Oops. How can I not get this to work? Nope. Keep select. Well, all right, fine. I will explain it outside then. If we recall, right, the Mishnah is about the situation of the two guys holding onto the garment, right? Each one says that they found it. Each one claims it's all theirs. And the law is twofold. One, that you split it, and that you take an oath that you have no less than half, right? And to this, Rabbi Chia comes along, and initially we understood that Rabbi Chia was attempting to use the Mishnah as support for the notion that if one person says to the other, "You owe me $100," and that person says, "I don't know you owe you anything," but that there are witnesses there who say, really, you owe 50, then the same law applies. You swear and you pay the 50. At that point, we decide that that's not exactly what Rebbe Chia meant, because we can't figure out how to square it. So we sort of retract that and say, well, that wasn't really the case that Rabbi Chia was talking about. Rabbi Chia was talking about a case in which one person says to another, you owe me 100. And the person says, I only owed you 50 and halach. And here it is. Okay. In that case, the person swears that they don't have to pay any, that's all it is, and they don't have to pay the rest of the money. And in a sense, the comparison is to our case. It's as if when each person is holding on to the garment, the fact that the other is holding on to the other half of the garment is the equivalent of each one saying to the other, here it is, right? I acknowledge that you are holding on to the other half, okay? And so trying to figure out exactly what this is, halacha, here, it's yours. This was something that, and this is exactly as I said before, that Sandy was sort of questioning last week, which is sort of, what does that mean? Isn't he now paying it back? How come that isn't an acknowledgement of the real debt? It doesn't make any sense. Okay, and so we'll start with Rashi. Okay, Rashi says, and I think this is how I explained it last week, which set us off on this, right? Vehelach, here it is. Lo hotzitim, I didn't spend it. Okay, the money I borrowed from you, right? That $50 bill, I didn't spend it. It's right here. Okay. Vahen shelcha b'kol makom shehem. And they were always yours wherever they were. Right? As if Rashi was attempting to say that normally when I borrow money, and we'll see this in a second, I'm borrowing a theoretical amount of money, right? Nobody expects to be paid back with precisely the same $20 bill that they borrowed, right? You pay back with a different $20 bill, because the whole point of borrowing money is I need the capital. I got to pay the rent, right? And then when I make more money, I'll pay you back with different money. And so what Rashi is claiming that here it is means that because I never spent it, it's as if I never borrowed it, right? Because I never spent it, it was always yours. It never stopped being yours and never started being mine. And it's as if you never loaned it to me at all.
But what's so peculiar about that is the rabbis everywhere else say possession is everything. Location is everything.
Yes.
So so it's amazing where Rashi's getting this from. Okay. And I'm sure that's what you're going to tell us.
Exactly right. Well, I don't know where Rashi's getting it from, but what he's thinking and why he's thinking it is now the question, because it seems odd to us. Why does Rashi say this? Rashi is not stupid, right? So what is he saying? Yeah, Lisa, you look perplexed and wanted to say something.
Does this have anything to do with money being more abstract than a garment that you're both holding in one hand, each the other?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's in part what we're thinking about, which is to say, once we start comparing objects which have physical realities, right? And what Rebbe Chia has done is compared a case of object to case of money, right? And as we, and as we know from Adam Smith or whatever, right? Money is a theoretical construct. It's not a thing, right? It's a social agreement that we think that these pieces of money are worth something. And so I think this is going to be exactly what we're getting at. Yeah, sorry.
Well, Rabbi, there's also, I'm sorry, Lisa, do you want to go?
So money has potential. A garment is right there.
Yes, I agree.
Well, go ahead.
But just to say something else, just remember that we also kind of think of the garment as potential ultimately, because remember, neither of them is getting the actual talus, we're selling the talis on eBay and we're splitting the proceeds, right? So maybe that's what's lying behind Rabbi Chia's thinking, is that, right, we're not cutting the garment down the middle. We're selling the garment and splitting it. So that's potential money too.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking of the situation where somebody walks in to a creditor and says, I need to borrow 50, and it's on his account.
Right.
So basically it's an entry into a book or
Right.
onto a scroll.
Right.
And it's never spent, it's never activated. In that circumstance, this whole thing makes some sense. I'm not saying, because I still don't know how it applies to the talis, just like Lisa said, but at least there, we're not talking about $50 in your hand.
Right. Okay. So now we have the problem, and really the problem is Rashi. Okay. And part of what this demonstrates is how influential Rashi is. Because from the moment that Rashi composes his commentary, it spreads like wildfire all over the Jewish world. So much so that there's even proof that Maimonides changes his Mishneh Torah to accord with Rashi. Right? When he writes the first edition of his code, seemingly it was before he received Rashi's commentary. And then after receiving Rashi's commentary, he's so influenced by that he changes the rules. Rashi, of course, is Ashkenazi, right? So even in the Spanish world, and the Spanish world is not particularly enamored of Ashkenazi commentaries, but Rashi's is so clear and so important that everybody has to deal with it. And so here I want to move next to the Ran. The Ran is Rabbeinu Nisim of Gerondi, right? Good Spanish sage. He is essentially the student of the Rashba, of Shlomo ben Aderet, who was the student of Ramban, Nachmanides. And they all say the same thing. If you were in my house, I would bring them all out for you. And very often the Ran just simply quotes his teacher, quoting his teacher. Sometimes the Ran writes in a little bit clearer Hebrew, so sometimes it's a little bit easier to understand. Okay. And so he says, Vehelach, right? Here it is. Piresh Rashi Zal, Rashi, may he rest in peace, says, Lo hotzeti, I didn't spend it. Vehem shelcha b'kol makom shehem. They were always yours wherever they were. Okay. Mashma, this means Di'i amar helach ma'ot acharina tachtehem, that if he had said, here you go, right, I'm paying you back with different coins, right, not the same $20 bill, even though he's producing them in the court, and he wishes to return them, right, to pay the guy back with these other coins, right, lav helachu, that doesn't count as helach. Right, that part of Rashi's claim is, I never spent them. They never were mine because I never exchanged them for goods. They always sort of remained in your possession in some theoretical sense, even though I had them, and that's why we don't make him we don't consider it as being a partial admission of the debt. Okay. V'al korchacha, therefore it must be the case that helach lo mishkachat le ela b'pikadon. It must be.
Rabbi, I'm not seeing,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm not seeing what you're reading on my screen. Are you seeing it, Lisa?
No.
Huh.
It's on a different page.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure took me a while to make sure.
Okay. What? Okay,
There we go.
That's
Okay.
now correct. But that's something. Is that
Okay.
right now? Now
Yeah,
do you
that's
see it?
right.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. All right. I'm sorry. So let me start from the beginning. Okay.
Yeah.
So vehelach. Okay. Rashi explains. Now you see my cursor and everything.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So Rashi, may he rest in peace, Zichrono livracha, says, Lo hotzeitim, I didn't spend them. Vehem shelcha b'kol makom shehem, and therefore they're yours wherever they may be, wherever they have ever been. Okay, so the first thing the Ran does is just quote Rashi. Okay, you can see it's exactly the same words. And now he explains what Rashi must be meaning. Mashma, this means Di'i amar helach ma'ot acharina tachtehem, that if somebody were to say, here you go, not with the original coins, but with replacement coins, right? Payback money. Even though he actually produces them in the court and says, here you go with them, and wishes to use them to pay his creditor back. Lav heilachu, it doesn't count as heilach, right? If I spend the $20 bill and then get another clean $20 bill out of the bank, that doesn't count because you could never say I never spent it because he didn't spend it, right? And therefore, al korchacha, it must be the case, heilach lo mishkachat la ela b'pikadon, that the only way that heilach could actually work is not with a loan, but with a deposit. Not a deposit. A pikadon is, hey, will you watch this for me, right? I'm going on vacation. Will you please? There's been a raft of bike thefts in San Francisco. Can I please put my bicycle in your house, right? Guard it for me. Right? And that's the only case that it could work, because then you could produce the pikadon, and you might do this with money. Let's say I have a fancy, very, very valuable ancient coin that I'm worried someone's going to steal. Hey, will you please keep my coin collection? Right? Money could be both as a loan, but could also be as this sort of deposit. Okay, I'm not sure quite what the English word for pikadon is. Okay, but yeah, a thing that somebody else is guarding for me, is taking care of for me. Okay, so according to Rashi, right, it can't be a loan. Okay, and he's going to say this more explicitly. Okay, and what's the distinction? Lefisha pikadon birshut ba'alav hu b'kol makom. What makes the pikadon is, even though you're guarding my bicycle, it doesn't mean that the bicycle is temporarily yours. You're just guarding it for me. It's always my bicycle, even if it's in your possession, as it were. Okay, and so this is really, I think, answering Sandy's issue, which is that if possession is 10/10 of the law, well, a pikadon is actually a marginal case, because it's not, it remains my bicycle, even though it's in your house and you're guarding it. You have certain responsibilities because you're doing me this favor. And if you're negligent and you say, you post on Facebook, Rabbi Bickart's awesome bike is in my window, I'm going out for coffee, come take a look at his gorgeous bike, and then it's gone when you got back, right? Then you would be liable, okay? But it's still my bike when you're holding on to it.
So can I, so then
Yeah,
in this case, according to Ron, no oath is required.
Correct.
And then also the difference between this and what we've been talking about is that there's no disagreement between the two parties as to what is there, what is owed, the identification, everything they're in agreement on.
Well, no, because remember the one party says you owe me 100, and the other party is saying I don't owe you anything except 50, and here it is.
Oh, okay, right, okay.
Good. Just want to get out of this. Okay. Great. So it would seem that Rashi's comment only makes sense if this is a pikadon. V'otan ma'ot ba'atzmam shel mafkidhen, and these coins are really the possession of the owner of the pikadon who gave them. Okay, so it's saying you gave me, which is that penny, the fancy penny that's worth all that money, right? Whatever it is, the wheat penny or the whatever penny, right? You gave me 2 pennies, and I said, no, you only ever deposited 1 penny, and here it is. Okay, that would be the case in which Rashi makes sense. Okay, aval, he says, b'milveh lo mishkachat la, but with a loan, it would mean that you could never actually say this, this Halach case could never obtain, according to Rashi's explanation. Why? For even if those same coins that you loaned me were still actually existent, ba'ayin, really, like in the eye, right? They're visible. It's the exact same one, right? Nonetheless, lo matzi lemeimar lo harei shelcha lefanecha b'kol makom shehem. It doesn't make any sense to say they're always yours wherever they may be, right? Why? Because we say in the second chapter of Kiddushin, I want to say something about the logical inference in a second, but he's quoting another portion of the Talmud. Gabeha, with regard to this case, de mikadesh b'milva ena mikudeshet, that a man who attempts to marry a woman with a loan, right? Remember, Jewish marriages happen with money. We always use a ring, right? But if it was a loan to say, hey, here, will you marry me? And here's the money I'm loaning you, as opposed to the money I'm giving you, right? Then she's not married. Why? Demilva afal pisha hu ba'ena, because a loan, even though it's still in the eye, it's still visible, it's still extant, right? Birshut lovehu, it's in the possession of the borrower. Okay, lo birshut malve, not in the possession of the lender. Okay, at all. Lo lechazara v'lo leonsin, not for the purposes of giving it back, nor for the purposes of negligence. Okay, the kevan shekain, and given that that's the case, heach yomar lo shehen shalo b'kol makom shehen. How could anybody ever say they were always yours? Doesn't make sense with a loan. The whole point of a loan is it's now your property. It's true that you, in exchange for taking possession of that property, you are now indebted to me a certain amount of money, but the object, the money is now your money. It's in your bank account. It's yours. Okay. Ela vadai l'divrei Rashi zal. It must be the case that according to Rashi, zichrono livracha, Helach, this, here you go, lo mishkachat la ela b'pikadon, aval lo b'malveh, can only exist in the case of pikadon, but not in a case of, okay, not of a loan. Okay, so Ron is not willing to say that Rashi is necessarily wrong. It's just that we've totally, if Rashi's right, we've totally shrunk the case of Rabbi Chia. We're now talking about something very different than what it was that we were talking about. And I find Ron's analysis of Rashi to be actually pretty compelling. Rashi seems to say this notion of wherever it is in the world, it's yours, really only makes sense if it's not a loan. Okay. And that's interesting. Now, one thing that we will say, of course, is that Ron makes an assumption about the Talmud, right? He assumes that the Talmud is an edited document that is consistent and coherent. And that if the Talmud says one thing over in Kiddushin, that thing must obtain here in Bava Metzia too, right? And that's an assumption that that we don't necessarily have to make. I'll give you an analogy, right? Sometimes from a very traditional Jewish perspective, we have to assert that a law given in Sefer Devarim and a law given in Sefer Shmot must concord with one another. They can't contradict each other because the Torah is a consistent document given by God to Moses. Well, if you're a critical historical scholar that thinks that Deuteronomy is written in the time of the Josian reform and that Exodus is written 300 years earlier, then you say, well, they don't agree, right? Why do we have to sync them? This one thinks this and this one thinks that. Okay, this notion that the Talmud is a fully edited, coherent document is really the invention of the Tosafot, of the generation of Rashi's grandchildren, all of whom are experts in one tractate, and then they sit around and study together. And anytime there's a parallel or a problem, one of them will say, well, wait a second, in my tractate, it doesn't say that. And then they harmonize. Okay, and so you can see not only how widespread Rashi's commentary is, but how widespread this notion that we can interpret one part of the Talmud in light of all the other parts of the Talmud. Okay. So part of what, and this happens, I would say Rashi's job, I think what Rashi thinks his job is just to get you through the page, right? To have it make sense here, right? And if some other thing doesn't make sense as a result, okay, well, we'll worry about that when we get to that part. But by the time of his grandchildren, we're not willing to do that. That a comment on the Talmud in one part has to accord with the Talmud in general, and that's what's leading Ron to say this. But Ron, having asserted that Rashi must be reading the Talmud as being about a pikadon, says, Ve'en kein da'at ha'gaonim, but the Gaonim didn't think this way. Okay, Ron, in addition to knowing the rest of the Talmud, also seems to have more information than Rashi does, and that's probably in part because Ron, right, in Provence, which is sort of on the border between the Ashkenazi world and the Spanish world. Spain, because Spain is really part of North Africa and the Muslim world, they had access to all kinds of Gaonic material, right? Material from the 8th and the 9th and the 10th century that moved across North Africa and into Spain, and that sort of coherent culture that the Ashkenazi Jews in the Rhineland, in Troyes, they didn't know about. Okay, so Rashi didn't have access to this other commentary. Okay, but Ron does, and so he's going to say, okay, Rashi reads the Talmud this way, but that's not how the Gaonim did. Now, unfortunately, I don't know. Maybe if I did more research, I could find this. Although I didn't in the footnotes I read, I didn't see where he's getting it from. We no longer possess this Gaonic commentary, so it'd be neat to see it in its original context. We don't have that anymore. It didn't survive antiquity or the Middle Ages. Okay, but he says shehem hiskimu dehelach ita bein b'milva bein b'pikadon. The Gaonim acknowledge that you could say helach regardless of whether or not it's a loan or a pikadon. How so? Okay, de b'milva kol zman shehen biyado v'hu mizuman latet letovea. Anytime that the money is actually in his hand and it's available to be given to the plaintiff, havele helach ufatur, that counts as helach and he's exempt. Okay, in other words, that being able to pay back the loan is almost as if you had already paid. Okay. Hi, Dara. Now, poor Dara is going to be terribly confused, right? Because we're in the middle of this situation. So I'm going to finish the statement and then maybe I'll back up a little bit. Okay. Okay. Kevan shehem otam hamaot ba'atzmam o ma'ot acherim. Whether they are those same coins or whether they are other coins. Okay. Because it is as if the person has already paid them back. Okay. Now, I'm not sure that you're going to like this very much. Okay. Because this now, Rashi, the advantage to Rashi is that the case makes sense. Right? It sort of makes sense that Rashi would say, well, if it wasn't actually a loan and it was just an object that you deposited with me for safekeeping, well, then it really was it was yours the whole time, right? And I don't owe you anything; it was yours. Okay, we're sort of back now, I think, to the way that we were confused about it. Is how does saying "here you go" count as not now having to be responsible for paying back, right? Why is that different from modeh b'miktzat hatana, for acknowledging a partial claim on which I would have to take the oath, right? So there's something a little bit odd, but what the Gaonim are saying is that if you're in court and you have the money on you, right? I think what they're saying is you're not really disputing, right? It's here it is. And once you've said here it is, it's already paid back. And we don't think about that as a kind of counterclaim or something like that. Okay. Dara, welcome. Do you want me to sort of sum up what we're doing briefly so you have some sense of what's going on?
That would be great. Thank you.
So if you remember last time, we were talking about this confusing term, helach, here you go, which is in Rabbi Chia's sort of redo. And the case is something like one person says to the other, you owe me $100. And the other one says, you never loaned me more than 50, and here's the 50, right? Here you go. And unlike in the case of Modeh b'miktzat hatana, where I say, I acknowledge that you did loan me 50 and I do owe you 50. And in that case, you'd have to swear on the rest of the money, right? That you pay back the 50 that you owe, and then you swear on the rest. That this is a different case, that somehow saying, here you go, doesn't obligate you to take the oath. Okay, and so what we're trying to figure out is, what does helach mean? Okay, and so we started with Rashi, and Rashi's claims is that I never spent the money. I have the same money, right? The same $20 bill that you loaned me. It's right here. I never spent it. And because I never spent it, it never really stopped being yours. Okay. To which Ran, this Provençal scholar, says, well, that makes sense, but there's a consequence logically, which is that therefore Rashi can only be explaining this helach word in the case of what we call a pikadon and not a loan. A pikadon, the example was, if I ask someone to watch my fancy bicycle while I go away, right? The bike never stops being mine, even though you're taking care of it for me, okay? And money, when I give somebody else money, it could be as a loan, but it could also be as a pikadon. Here, watch my coin collection, right? Because what I want you to do is not give me different coins of that denomination, but those same coins that I scrubbed and put carefully in my album or whatever it is like that, okay? And in that sense, it makes sense because it's a pikadon, it was always yours. But the problem is that we have now, if we accept Rashi's comment, understanding, we've totally shrunk the case. It's no longer about a creditor, right? A lender and a borrower. It's about a shomer, a guardian of an object. And that seems strange. And therefore, Ran is telling us that the Gaonim have a totally different commentary, right? They say, no, it's not just about a pikadon. It's also about a loan. Whether he pays back those actual coins or whether he pays back different coins, helach does not mean I never spent them, they never stopped being yours. It means because I'm here with the money in hand, ready to pay you, it means I'm no longer a creditor for that money because here it is, it's yours. I'm not paying you back, it's yours somehow. And right. But nonetheless, because even though the Gaonim are saying that it does apply in the case of a loan, it also applies in the case of a pikadon. Okay, and the difference is of a pikadon, kol hecha demod elei, anytime he admits to him, you're right, you did give your bicycle to me, afal pisha einan mezuman biyado, even if they're not available. Right? Ela omeid ba'agam, even if it's sitting in the swamp. And this is another quote from another piece of the Talmud. This comes from the 3rd chapter of our tractate. But the notion is a pikadon, and there it's about a cow. It's sort of classic Talmudic funny case. If you lent me your cow, right, and it's still your cow. Now I got your cow stuck in the swamp, right? But it's still your cow. It doesn't matter where it is. Even if I can't produce it in Beit Din, it's your cow, right? Havile Helach. If it were a pikadon and I say Helach, even if the pikadon isn't with me in the court, unlike the loan where it has to be in the court, ready to be paid back in order to be Helach, the pikadon, even if it's not in court, it's stuck in the swamp. Okay, then Havile Helach. It's still Helach. Why? Mishum de pikadon, because when it comes to a pikadon, kol hecha de ita birshuta de mare ita. Any place it is in the world, it's always owned by its original master. Okay? So what we have now is two competing versions of how do we understand Helach. Okay, we have Rashi, that Helach only obtains when it comes to a pikadon. And we have the Gaonim that Ron is quoting saying, no, even with a loan. And what Helach means is, here you go, ready to go. And something like that, here you go, ready to go, means that it's as if I never borrowed them. And I would just say at this point, we can see an advantage to each commentary. Rashi makes sense, right? Clearly, Rashi is so bothered by the notion that because I have it in my hand and say, here you go, it's as if I never borrowed it. Rashi says, but I did borrow it. And that's probably why Rashi interprets the way he does. He's saying, because that doesn't make sense to me, I'm going to interpret this context is about being a pikadon, even though Rabbi Chia didn't ever mention that word. Okay, so Rashi follows the logic. The Gaonim seem to follow the words, right? By all accounts, the words do seem to be talking about a creditor and a debtor, right? And that therefore, even though it doesn't make much sense, it seems like it must be the case that somehow saying, here you go, is as a legal fiction that I never borrowed them, okay? And here I just want to quote my teacher, Joel Roth, because this is something he taught us many, many times in Talmud class. And he always taught in Hebrew, this perfectly American accented Hebrew, and always talked about the difference between what he would call higayon and lashon. Higayon means sense, right? Meaning, and lashon, language, right? That when the language and the logic don't quite sync, you see that some of the medieval commentators will go after what they think logically the Talmud seems to be saying, and others go by about what it literally seems to be saying, okay? And so maybe how are we supposed to, that may be a useful framework of trying to figure out why these different commentators say what they say. Before we go any further, like straw poll, anybody convinced by Rashi? Anybody convinced by the Gaonim? Anybody thoroughly confused?
You know, I'm sorry, go ahead, Lisa.
Somewhat confused. Go ahead, Sandy.
I think that I want to look at it through the eyes of the rabbis. They're obviously saying that they're regarding a debtor differently if he has money on him or not. I mean, you know, that to me is the way to put this together. So if I get the difference between the higayon and the lashon, but just from the point of view of who has to say an oath, it's almost as if you've got money on you and you're walking around with that debt, that somehow you're of a different moral or some other category that doesn't require an oath.
Because you're good. You're good.
Lisa, go ahead.
Because you're good for it. If you've got it, you've got it. That's it.
Even if it's not all of it, because they've given up. In the absence of a piece of paper, they've given up completely, trying to determine what's actually the truth.
That's right. Because we have, remember in this case, we have no witnesses. We have no document. All we have is the words of the claimants. Now, remember in the back of our mind should always be, if he were only kofer hakol, if he would only deny the whole thing, then he'd go off scot-free, right? So to some degree, given that there's a better lie that he could have told, right, we're tempted to trust him, right?
Also, we're tempted.
Yeah.
Well, also because he's the accused.
That's right.
Right, so the accused gets the advantage in court.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly right.
Innocent until proven guilty.
Right, exactly right. Or as we keep saying, hamotzi mechavero alav hara'aya, the burden of proof falls upon the one who wishes to take the money out of the other guy's hand, right? If you've got it, the burden of proof is not on me. The burden of proof is on you to prove to me that I should give you the money. But I think what you're both getting at is right. There's something about being in court saying the money's here, it's yours, right? That doesn't make me a debtor anymore. I don't owe you. If I'm claiming your money's right here, take it. Then I don't owe you anymore because here it is, something like that. Okay, so we have two.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe this is something that we've talked about before, you've clarified, but I'm just trying to figure out in the halach, even if it's not the full amount, he doesn't have to take an oath. Is that correct?
Correct.
Even if it's not the full amount.
Well, it's not the full amount that the plaintiff claims. It's the full amount that the defendant claims. Right, the full amount. He says, you only ever paid me 50. And here's the distinction. If he says, you only owe me, I only owe you 50. I don't have it, but I only owe you 50. Then he has to pay the 50 and take an oath on the rest. But if he says, here's the 50 and here you go, then he doesn't have to take the oath. Okay, and that's the weirdness. I'm trying to figure out exactly why that is.
Why? I mean, I'm wondering if the goal is just to get some money back to the guy who says, just like whatever it is, even if it's not all of it. If you give some of it back, if you have it with you and you can give it back at the moment, then you're good.
Maybe, right, and we could come up with all kinds of reasons for this, right? One, we want to clear the backlog of cases, right? Just like in our society, where we know that one of the issues plaguing the justice system is just so many cases. This is why so few cases, I mean, some of you may know this better than I do, but so few cases go to trial because we wouldn't have time to adjudicate them all, right? And if there was no justice, then nobody would ever come to the Beit Din. And this may be lying behind this, in earlier times, in Roman times, what's to prevent Judeans from going to Roman courts? Right? Presumably there must be some incentive to going to the rabbinic court, because at least you'll get some of your loan back, right? Or at least you'll get something, something like that. May be what's lying behind this. Exactly right. Okay. So now we get to the Ritzbah, Yom Tov ben Avraham. I don't know exactly on which holiday Yom Tov ben Avraham was born, but I guarantee that he was born on Yontif. Otherwise, his mama wouldn't have called him Yom Tov. So, when someone's named Pesach or, whatever, that's know when their birthday is. Okay. So, and Ritzbah is a great Spanish authority of the 13th century. So he says, Piresh Rashi Zal, right? Rashi explains, Heilach, here you go, Lo hotzitim, I didn't spend it. V'harehem shelcha b'kol makom shehem. And here they're yours, wherever they may be, wherever they have been. V'nir'eh midvarav tarte. It seems two things from Rashi. There are two consequences from what Rashi is saying. Number one, chada, the milva shehotziah, that a loan that was spent, afal pishno telo ma'od acherim bebeitin, even though the person's now in court, ready to pay them back, lo chashiv helach, can never be considered helach, right? If you spent the money, then saying, here you go, according to Rashi, cannot count, right? Because that's exactly what he says. Okay, so that's number one. Ve'od, and the second thing I learned from Rashi, to kol shelo hotzi'am hem ba'ayin birshuto, that anytime I didn't spend them and they are visible, they're still in existence, it's as if they were in the creditor's possession. That somehow the loan hasn't actually been triggered until I spend the money. And until I spend the money, it's still kind of in the creditor's account. Okay? Okay? And even if they're not currently in the Beit Din, that's Halach. Okay. All right.
Right. That makes no sense. That's not what Rashi said. And you would think that somebody who walks into court with nothing in his hands would have to swear an oath.
Yes.
So he's sort of, this is how he's interpreting Rashi. That's all it is, right? Okay.
Exactly
all
right.
Okay.
And he may be doing that because he, unlike Ron, who says, okay, Rashi makes sense. There are consequences I might not like for that interpretation of the Talmud, but at least I can make Rashi make sense. And the Gaonim say something different, and there you go, 2 options, take your pick, something like that. Ritva, I think, is moving Rashi into a ridiculous corner in order to argue with him. Okay, because as he continues, he says, "Va'adarabba, it's the other way around. Ipcha mistabra." This is a great Talmudic phrase that you should all incorporate into your daily parlance. Ipcha mistabra means the opposite is reasonable. Okay, I don't know how you say this in normal English. I say this to my kids all the time, right? When you say one thing and I think it's exactly the other way around, you say ipcha mistabra, right? It's exactly the other way around.
I used to say, this must be opposite day.
There you go. Exactly right. Right. Can I have right? Abba, can I have, if I'm really nice to you, can I have ice cream for breakfast? Right. No. All right. The kol shenoten ma'ot bebeit din ze helach gamur hu. Right. That really what he's saying is that anybody who gives the coins in court, if I have the money in court, that is what helach means. Ki'ilu para, it's as if I've already paid. Okay, this is very much like the Gaonim's Perush, right? As long as I've got it there, and I'm saying to you, here's the money, it's as if I've already paid you back. It's as if I don't owe you anything. Okay. V'have be'idach kofer bakol. And it would be if he had therefore contested the whole amount. Right? Remember, that unlike the modeh b'miktzat ta'ana, the person who acknowledges a partial indebtedness, who has to take the oath, one who says, I've never seen you before in my life, can you prove it? Prove it. I don't owe you anything. That person doesn't have to take an oath. And so now what Ritva has done is said, this Rabbi Chia makes a lot of sense. The reason why he doesn't have to take an oath is because it's not like the modeh b'miktzat ta'ana, the partial admission. It's more like the total denial of the claim, because my saying, here's the money, right? It's as if you never lent it to me. And if it's as if you never lent me that half, my claim is now as if I don't owe you anything. Okay, so that makes sense according to Ria, and I think this is much better. Okay, v'chol she'einam sham bebeit din, and anything that's not there in the court, if I don't have the money right now, ein kan priya shel klum. This ain't payment of nothing. Okay, right? I haven't paid you anything. Just the fact that I have the money, I promise I have the money. No, either you have the money in court or you haven't paid it back. Umishum to have a zuzi de malve gufe bershute, my have. Okay, and the fact that the coins of the loan themselves are in his possession, who cares, right? What good does that do to say, oh, well, I have it back at home? That makes no difference. Okay. Because the whole point of a loan is to spend it. It's mine. And now that it's mine, that it being mine is what confers the indebtedness back on the indebtedness to pay you back. Okay. So Ritva now is making the crucial distinction. He's saying very much, I think, like the Gaonim, which is that the distinction is, if I have the money with me in court, it's as if I've already paid it back. And the thing that he's explained very well is that, therefore, my claim is I don't owe you anything, and therefore that's why he doesn't have to take the oath. Umihu, nonetheless, but pikadon, when it comes to a pikadon, vadai kol hecha shehu ba'ayin birshuto chashuv heilach. It doesn't matter where it is, because the whole point of a pikadon is it's always in the original owner's possession, even if it's in my house. Okay. And therefore, it can be considered heilach. So if it was really a pikadon, yes, it's yours. I don't know, right? It doesn't matter where it is, even if it's the cow in the swamp. Okay. Afal pi she'eino bebeit din, even if it's not the pikadon itself is not present in the court. The pikadon kol hecha deite birshuta damare ita. That's that same phrase. That a pikadon, any place it is, it exists in its master's place. It does. Okay. So unlike Ron, who wants to say, okay, Rashi makes sense, but it has to be a pikadon, Ritva is saying Rashi makes no sense. Obviously, it can be a pikadon, but it doesn't have to be a pikadon. And the whole issue about a loan is the distinction of whether the coins are there, present now, or not. And just personally, I find Ritva very compelling. I mean, again, I'm not exactly. It's more. It's a step farther than the Gaonic Perush, because it explains why you shouldn't take an oath. Because once I've said these are yours, then my claim is not a partial admission, but it's a total denial, and that's why he doesn't have to take the oath. Okay. Well, one more, if we have a little bit of time. So far, we've only been dealing with explicit commentaries on the Talmud, medieval commentaries on the Talmud. But you can also read codes as commentaries. So if half of the traditional Talmud study is digging through big volumes of these obscure medieval sages for their commentaries on the Talmud, the other major focus of traditional Talmud study is to mine the depths of Maimonides' code to figure out how he was reading the Talmud in order to get to the law he got to. So in the brief time we have left, I want to read a small portion of Maimonides and a commentary on Maimonides, right? This is the pleasure and the pain of Jewish textual study, right? Everything is commentary. You know what book in Hebrew has the most commentaries on it? If you were to go to the National Library of Israel, which book has the most commentaries on it? So you'd guess, Genesis, right? Or Masechet Brachot. But no, it's Rashi's commentary on Genesis that has the most commentaries written on it. There are more commentaries written on Rashi's commentary on Genesis than there are on Genesis. Okay, which says a couple of things. One, how much the Jews love commentaries, and two, how important Rashi is, right? Okay. So what the Rambam says is follows, and he constructs a case which is complicated. Maneh uchli yesh li biyadecha. Okay. Ein lecha bidi ela hakli v'ha lecha. Okay, so one person says, you owe me both 100. You have both 100 and a vessel of mine in your hand. And the other one says back, I have nothing but the vessel, and here it is. Okay, so it's really very close to our claim. He even says, ha lacha. That's very interesting. So you asked before whether it's Hebrew or Aramaic. For the Rambam, who writes only in Hebrew, he must think this is Hebrew. Okay. So now it says, Hareze patur. This guy is exempt from taking an oath. V'nishpa heset, but he has to take a rabbinic oath. She'ein lo etzlo elazeh, that he has nothing except for this. Okay. So great. To which the Magid Mishnah says, okay, and this is Vidal of Tolosa in late 14th century Spain. He quotes this. Maneh uchli yesh li biyadecha v'chulei. $100 and a vessel you have of mine is in your hand. So he says, Midivrei Rabbeinu, from the words of our master, what Maimonides seems to suggest, it seems, even though this vessel is really a pikadon, im lo amar heilach, had he not said heilach, afal pisha hu ba'ayin, avile modeh b'miktzat, then he would be a partial, he would be the partial admitter. And he says, Aval ha-Ramban v'ha-Rashba, the teachers of the Ran, okay, which we saw before, hochichu, they proved min ha-sugiyah shebeperek kama de Metzia, from the first chapter of Bava Metzia, dekol pikadon shehu be'eno, that any pikadon that exists visibly, vehodelo, right, and he admits it, afilu hu ba'agam, even if it's somewhere else in the swamp, havele heilach, it counts as heilach. Why? Dekol heicha de'ita birshuta demare ita, that any place that it exists, right? It exists in his possession. Ve'en zeh modeh b'miktzat, and this is not a partial admission of the claim, and therefore he shouldn't have to take even the rabbinic oath. Okay, so Magid Mishnah has said, Rambam, you're wrong, right? From our Talmud, at least if we read it according to the way that the Ramban and the Rashba, right? That is the Gaonim, the Ritba too, right? Then it doesn't make sense. Okay. But the rest of everything Maimonides says makes sense in this. Okay. So I haven't quite figured out exactly how Maimonides understands our case, but clearly he must be reading it in some other way, right? Maimonides must understand heilach to mean some third thing, okay? And I don't quite know exactly how Maimonides is understanding this. And among the things, if we were gonna write a traditional Talmud shir, we might now spend weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. We'd close our Talmuds, right? And we'd open up our Rambams, and we'd only study the Rambam, and we'd study all kinds of other passages in the Talmud to try to figure out, how does Maimonides read this passage? So, for me, I think Ritba ultimately made the most sense. Magid Mishnah seems to agree that Ritba makes the most sense. And so that's how I propose, as we continue to study the Talmud, we should read this Talmudic passage. But it's also a reasonable proof of how you can't just always trust Rashi, right? Rashi's right 90% of the time. Thank God for Rashi, we wouldn't understand the Talmud. But 10% of the time, right? Poor Rashi, right? Somebody else after him who has his commentary, but has access to more material and better ways of thinking, can come up with a better commentary. And once again, I think in part this is the lesson of Talmud study, which is that just because the great rabbi said something, is a great authority, doesn't mean that later authorities who know that and other stuff can't argue with that great authority and say occasionally that, that Rashi's wrong. If Rashi's wrong, then any other rabbi in the course of Jewish history can be wrong. And we who know that and have other material are in a position to change and to admit and to say, I have a better way to read things. So
great.
Hopefully you've enjoyed this little diatribe into advanced Talmud. Go ahead, Sandy.
Yeah, no, I did. I have a quick question. For Pikadon, do you have the right of use?
You have the right of use. I think, yes, and I believe so.
I mean, just because in the case of a vessel,
right,
that would be a distinguishing
not only
characteristic. If you didn't, then if you use the vessel, it's a loan.
Correct.
Yeah.
You do. Yeah.
I was going to say,
so.
if you used it, you can't say you gave it to me and here it is. I didn't use it. So it falls into a different category.
Yeah, I can't quite remember. I should look this up. I should know the answer to this, and I can't remember exactly if it may be that well, it may be that you don't have real right of use, but you may be obligated to take care of things in certain ways, right? You might have to, if I loan you my bicycle for a year, you may have to lube the chain so it doesn't rust. The classic example is loaning someone books. Of course, they mean scrolls. And therefore, I think you have to roll it every certain amount of days so it doesn't get stuck in that place and things like that. I think you don't have real right of use. You can't go riding around on the bike, but I think you have to sort of protect it. But it's a good question. I'll look into
yeah,
that.
because, right, as Dara was saying, if you used it, then, yeah, okay, good, great.
Well,
I think
I
that's
have a
right.
question.
Yeah,
Give another
Lisa.
comment. The order in which these discussions happen, we started with a garment, right?
Right.
We started with a garment and then we went to money and then we went to a vessel. Is
Right.
there significance in the order? In
Well,
other words, a garment is very different than money.
Yes. Now, I'm not sure that now I translated kli as vessel or as utensil.
Yeah, I know.
But I think that garments are considered kelim, and in fact, kelim sometimes can mean clothing. So I think kli here really just means an object, where the point is it's a pikadon, right, as opposed to a loan. The real difference is when I give you my object, when you borrow my object, you give me back that thing, right? As opposed to money, where you don't give me back that thing, you give me back something of equivalent value, which is different. If I gave you my bicycle, you don't say, oh, well, here's another bicycle, here's a different bicycle, right? That's not how that works. So I think in this sense, the garment is more like a vessel. And I think why the Mishnah chooses a talit is a good question. Why doesn't it say, shnaim ochazin bakli, but davar, right? In any kind of, in bachafetz, in an object, right? Why do they pick the garment? Is that because it's sort of more logical or that you could imagine that both, it's hard to imagine two people really holding on to a spoon or a mug at the same time, but a talus, right, is sort of imaginable, and so maybe that's how they've constructed the case. But it's a good question, and I wonder, and especially I think we saw this in the first Mishnah, is that it gives two examples which are pretty much the same thing, right, of the talit case and then of the animal case. Right, one is pulling the animal, and the other is riding on the animal. Why is that different from the talit? Sort of the same thing. The Talmud will have to ask, and as I recall, it's usually this process of the hava amina, that if it had only taught me this case, then I might have thought something stupid about the other case, and therefore, even though it's redundant, that redundancy is there in order to not let me get confused, and is giving me multiple, since I might have some reason to think they are different, it tells me that they're the same. So.
Thank you.
But this is the kind of thing, and part of the reason why I wanted to do this, even though it's a little bit weird, this is part of the thing that's sort of in adult ed courses, and especially when we do things in English, people never get a real sense of sort of how deep down the rabbit holes you can get, but also sort of how the variety of medieval authorities really are careful thinkers. And finally, that some of our initial sort of, well, Rashi's not quite making sense here. How do we explain this case? We are just like the medieval authorities. And I found it very meaningful that when students came up with really cool interpretations to say, you and the famous Ritba, who lived 850 years ago and was the leader of a community and had the same thing to say, that's actually very empowering. And it shows that, we're not so stupid. And that we too can come up with novel and correct and compelling reads of things, and that we should try to use our brains to try to figure that kind of stuff out. So there you have it.
Thank you so much.
Shabbat
Shalom, Chag Sameach.
I hope that Shavuot is fun. I don't know what's going on in your community for Shavuot. It's probably not normal, but it's probably more normal than last year, so that's good. So, so we'll
You
pick
too.
it up next week.
Thank you.
Thanks. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom. Be well.
Shabbat Shalom.
Um,